Admiral Tanaka surveyed the wreckage of thousands of ships from both sides of the battle. As he watched, rescue ships were scouring the wreckage for survivors. Thousands of capital ships floated dead in space, their hulls cracked open or holed from the barrages thrown at both sides. Many smaller craft were hardly more than a cloud of debris, the frozen bodies of their pilots nearby. The fighting in space was over. The destruction of the enemy flagship threw the Wraith into complete disarray. Any form of organized resistance fell apart and left the Wraith ships easy pickings for the Coalition fleet. The battle on the surface still raged, but Coalition ground forces, assisted by hundreds of thousands of slaves rising against their oppressors, had Wraith ground forces reeling. Coalition warships assisted with the orbital bombing of marked targets. The death throes of the Wraith's once vast empire consumed the lives of millions on both sides, but the campaign was finally over. Admiral Tanaka thought to himself, the long campaign of revenge was over. It was time to rebuild the human race. Kovvac was sound asleep when the chirp of the communicator woke him. "This better be good," he muttered to himself, and was surprised to see the Kexian ambassador to the Great Council. "I'm sorry to disturb your rest, Elder Kovvac, but a matter has come up, and your assistance would be greatly appreciated." Kovvac listened in stunned silence as the ambassador explained the situation to him. When he had finished, Kovvac finally spoke. "Of course. I will dress and meet you in the capital chambers." All across the territory that made up the Grand Council, a single phrase was broadcast on every channel and every screen. It appeared in both Galactic Common and the native languages. It simply said, "We are coming." This is repeated every day in the Grand Council's chambers just after the session was opened. The council members became more agitated by the day. Was a new enemy announcing their arrival? What did it mean? On the 9th day, another message went out on every channel, "We are here." The Grand Council received another message, "Tomorrow is Judgment Day." This phrase sent the council into an uproar. Calls of distress, fear, and fury rang out in the halls in hundreds of voices. Everyone was so agitated that none noticed the handful of delegations that simply sat and watched with their equivalent of little smiles on their faces. Even the normally dour Barretsons seemed highly amused at the chaos. It had been many cycles since Kovvac had been in the Grand Council chambers, but he wouldn't miss this for anything. He never thought he'd set foot in these chambers again. He took his seat in the Kexian delegation's designated area and looked around at the various delegations, seeing the look of fear and worry on their faces. He nodded to the few beings that weren't acting in the same way. Garnick, the long-serving council speaker, brought the noise to a hush with a single tap of the bell-like device on the podium. He spoke the ritual opening. "This convocation has now begun. Let all speak as equals and maintain the bonds of peace while inside these hallowed halls." Before Garnick could say another word, Korkan spoke up. "Council Speaker, if I may?" Garnick seemed annoyed by the breach of protocol, but saw no reason to object. "The Speaker recognizes the Kexian ambassador." Korkan walked to the center of the chamber. "I ask permission for a guest to address this august body," the last said with a subtle mockery most of the ambassadors missed. A voice shouted from the upper rows, "Why should we waste our time with this when there is an important matter to discuss?" Korkan faced the direction the question came from. "Tut-tut, Ambassador Zanara, you know the rules. Until my request is approved or denied, no other comments may be made." Garnick rumbled his agreement and then followed up with, "Does any ambassador second this motion?" "Seconded," came the reply from a half-dozen ambassadors. Korkan looked at the speaker, his eyes asking the question. Garnick simply said, "Proceed." Korkan once again addressed the assembly. "Honored ambassadors, dignitaries, and guests. For the last several days, we've received a series of cryptic messages, and we've worried and wondered about them." With a dramatic pause before continuing, the last one indicated today to be Judgment Day. "My guest will enlighten us today about the meanings of those messages." With that, he stepped back and indicated the center of the floor with a wave of his arm. There was a slight shimmering, and a being in armor seemed to appear from nowhere. The helmet's faceplate was opaque and gave no hint of the occupant. All they could tell was that they had one head and two arms and were bipedal. The being stepped forward. "I am President Matilda Becker of the New Terran Republic and head of the Andromedan Coalition." She looked at the various members of the assembly. "The humans have returned to the galaxy of our birth." She paused at the uproar her words elicited and waited until it died down. 50 human years ago, the Wraith, as we call them, attacked members of this Grand Council. Scorn filled her voice as she used the title. "We called for war against them to support the weaker races they attacked. This council talked and did nothing. Only 7 governments stood at our side and drove the Wraith from this galaxy." She began to pace as she talked. "And what was our reward?" She was angry as she answered her question. "We were betrayed by a member of this council and our worlds were destroyed." She practically shouted, "Our home, our cradle world, and the rest of the Sol system were obliterated." She reached under her uniform and pulled out some sort of tag on a chain around her neck. This is what we still have of our worlds. Each human ID tag carries a piece of our destroyed worlds as a reminder of what we lost." She stopped and faced a section of the chamber. Her voice turned menacing. "And a promise to deal with the ones who almost extinguished the spark of the human race. 5 human years ago, we repaid the Wraith for their destruction of our worlds and the genocide against our race," she continued. "We made friends and allies in the Andromeda Galaxy who had also suffered at their hands. We formed the Coalition and fought the Wraith across hundreds of worlds and vast expanses of space until we stood on the doorstep of their homeworld. Millions of lives were lost in that final campaign before it was done. The Wraith's empire was liberated, and the few surviving Wraith were exiled to a small moon. They will never be allowed to leave it." She looked up as she spoke. "We learned many new things and found new technology to improve the lives of all the members of the Coalition. My armor is just a small part of those improvements." She then looked directly at one delegation as she said, "And we learned who betrayed us." The chamber once again broke out in a cacophony of noises from hundreds of sources. President Becker called out, "Ambassador Sin Amana of the B'rath," looking directly at the B'rath delegation. "Will you join me on the chamber's floor?" Every eye turned to look at the B'rath ambassador. They all saw the same shimmer as before, and 4 humans were revealed to be standing behind them. The wild-eyed B'rath looked for a way to escape, but the 4 humans prevented that. They picked him up and marched him to the floor. They weren't particularly cruel in their handling of the ambassador, but neither were they respectful of his position. Once the ambassador was brought before her, the Terran president nodded to her troopers and they released the ambassador, who immediately slumped to the floor. President Becker towered over the B'rath ambassador. "Sin Amana of the B'rath, your people stand accused of providing information to the Wraith that led to the destruction of hundreds of human colonies and billions of human lives." Chinamana looked up and pleaded, "I wasn't even born when this happened. I'm innocent." "True, but it was the B'rath government that did, and you are a member of that government," she said, her voice thick with anger. She took a round device from a pouch on her belt and tossed it on the floor. It projected a huge 3D image of a planet. "Do you recognize this world, Ambassador?" she asked. "It's B'rath," he replied. The image changed to a security feed from one of the B'rath warships in orbit. "Do you recognize the B'rathi at the bridge of this cruiser?" "It's my son. Please don't hurt him," he begged. She pushed another button. "Speak to him." The ambassador looked confused. "How?" She indicated the image. It was obvious something was happening on the ship as techs furiously worked on their consoles, and his son was visibly confused. "Badra, it is your father." He tentatively spoke, not believing it would work. The image of his son started looking around for the source before replying. "Father, where are you?" "I am in the Grand Council chambers." The president cut the ambassador off. "Tell him something is going to happen and to not do anything stupid." Chinamana spoke to his son and relayed the message. She nodded at one of the guards, and from behind the helmet, a voice simply said, "Now." The image split to show the planet and the cruiser's bridge at the same time. Hundreds and then thousands of specks of lights appeared above the globe, and some were seen through the cruiser's view screen. Each speck grew until it flashed, and in its place was a ship. Thousands of ships were suddenly there. You could see the startled look on Cinnamana's son as this happened. He was just starting to give some orders when the president opened the link again. Tell him to stop what he is doing and radio their fleet to stand down. Despite his misgivings, the ambassador passed the message on and convinced his son to give the orders. Excellent, Ambassador. You are doing great, President Becker said with a hint of condescension in her voice. She turned to address the assembly. Esteemed ambassadors, I wish to introduce you to a small portion of the coalition's war fleet. She paused for dramatic effect before continuing. They just jumped in directly from Andromeda. At this pronouncement, the chambers erupted into shouts and insults, calling her a liar and worse. She held up her hand for quiet, but it took Speaker Garnick practically smashing the bell-like device to quiet them down. I say this not to brag, but as a warning. Calling in reinforcements would be a very bad idea. She began to walk around the floor again, focusing their attention on her movements. As for those that called me a liar, I would ask some friends to verify the claim. She dramatically swept her arm towards the delegations of her longtime friends and allies. Before revealing ourselves for this session, we made contact with our old allies from the fight against the Wraith. She smiled warmly at the Kexian delegation, whose ties with humanity ran very deep. And representatives of their governments were invited to visit our new homeworld and also testify to our ability to travel with such speed. She looked around the chambers before saying, My friends, if you would be so kind as to verify my claims. With that, the delegations from the Kexian, Kithranka, Barithians, Zathrex, Gallians, Malakitsan, and Zrexians stood up and confirmed the humans' claim. While some might have been willing to call out the smaller races as being puppets of the humans, no one would ever call out the Kithranka as liars. They'd been known to rip off the offenders' appendages and beat them to death with it. Part of joining the Grand Council as a new ambassador was being specifically warned about it and watching the footage of a massive Sholkor, learning that lesson the hard way. Despite being twice his size, the Kithrankan ambassador ripped off the Sholkor ambassador's tail and nearly killed him with it. Only its vast size and pleading from the speaker kept it from dying. Now where were we? She said, tapping her finger against her chin as if she was thinking. It was obvious to Kovvac that she was enjoying herself immensely. Our betrayal at the hands of the Broth. Staring directly at the ambassador, she looked at one of her guards, an unspoken question passing between them. At his nod, she turned to the globe and changed the image. It showed a large room, decorated with priceless gems and metals. Ambassador Cinnamana, do you recognize this room? She asked. He tore his eyes away from her predatory gaze with a distinct effort. It's the Brothi throne room, he replied, confusion and fear showing on his face. President Becker nodded to her aide again, who gave a barely audible command over his comms. Now! The view changed as the camera turned to show dozens of Brothi on their knees, human soldiers standing behind them. The camera then panned to the left and showed a Brothi male gowned in bejeweled robes kneeling before a pair of humans. Ambassador Cinnamana was shocked but numbly answered when the president ordered him to confirm his identity. That is Emperor Cartharax Thor of the Brothi Empire. He turned to look at the human president again. But how the throne room is the most secure place in the empire? President Becker merely winked and replied, Trade secret. She looked around the chamber and raised her voice. Does anyone dispute that our actions are permitted under Grand Council law? No one objected, she continued. In light of their actions assisting the Wraith in their genocidal actions against my people, does anyone contest our right to deal out justice in any manner we chose, aside from total annihilation of the Broth? Once again, the chamber remained silent. The president glanced at her aide and nodded. He gave another barely audible command, and one of the humans guarded the emperor prodded him with his boot. Can you hear me, Your Majesty? She asked. The kneeling figure just nodded. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you, she said. Yes, I can hear you, the emperor replied, his voice and demeanor submissive. Good. I want you to hear my proclamation of our actions in obtaining justice for you for enabling such a horrible crime against humanity at the same time as this assembly. She took another dramatic pause before continuing. The order to relay the location of our worlds came directly from Emperor Catharax III. His death put him beyond our reach, but we do have you, Emperor. She looked out at the assembly before continuing. You will abdicate your throne immediately. The monarchy is dissolved, and you will be our guest on New Terra. She turned to the Brathi ambassador, Chinamana. You will help organize a new government for your people. I don't care which form it takes, but choose one to benefit your people. Chinamana nodded before speaking. What are the other terms? Your empire took several colonies by aggressive actions against weaker races. You will give them back, she said. How you do it to be decided by negotiations with the respective races. Chinamana looked crestfallen. I understand. His reply was barely audible. And what happens to my people? The president smiled and simply said, Nothing. Chinamana's head jerked up, thinking he misheard her. Nothing. Your people are innocent, and we do not hold the actions of others against the innocent, she answered. She directed her last remark to the rest of the Grand Council. But keep in mind, while we might forgive, we do not forget.